Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and while I have been a little under the weather this week, I thought I had to get a video out for you guys because I have 4 classic sci-fi books that I want to talk with you about. So let's get started with To Your Scattered Bodies Go by Philip Jose Farmer. When famous adventurer Sir Richard Francis Burton dies, the last thing he expects to do is awaken naked on a foreign planet along the shores of a seemingly endless river. But that's exactly where Burton and billions of other humans, plus a few non-humans, find themselves. Before starting this book, I had heard that it was super weird and trippy and funny, so I was kind of expecting things along the lines of a guy with a top hat that could morph into something like a time-traveling lion, and he'd have a departing catchphrase such as, "I guess it's not lion time in this timeline." I don't know, maybe not that exactly, but this book is wildly imaginative. And while it is somewhat out there, I think it's still quite accessible. The ideas are ambitious, but the story is grounded in a Lord of the Flies-esque storyline that to me feels very human. There are some psychedelic elements, but not to the extent that this feels like a Stephen King fever dream. And while it is somewhat amusing at times, this is not a light-hearted book. This book was much heavier thematically than I was expecting it to be. So that's the style. What about the story? It's a fun adventure. It brings a group of characters together and they set out on a quest. It is a familiar setup, but it works really well for 2 reasons. The first is that it is an interesting world. Are we in heaven? Are we in hell? Are we on another planet? Or are we in a simulation? This is the primary mystery that our adventurers are trying to solve as they traverse across the seemingly endless Riverworld. And finding out all the little oddities about Riverworld and trying to piece them together in order to form a larger picture is a great element of the story. The second reason it works is that Farmer does a great job of developing characters in a relatively short space of time. This book is only around 220 pages or so, and yet he's able to craft multiple interesting character arcs. I also really liked the interesting character dynamics and relationships because the narrative brings together a wide variety of characters from varied cultures and time periods. But the reason why I'll remember this book is because of how hard-hitting it was thematically. The story places these characters in a unique setting, and then it asks in what ways they will behave differently, and in what ways they will repeat the mistakes of human history. The book wasn't afraid to show humanity at its most violent, its most prejudiced, and its most ugly. I found it to be a philosophically rewarding look at an individual's journey, as well as the trajectory of mankind. Do I have any criticisms? Well, for me, I think the book could have benefited from some stronger female characters, and at times I felt like I was being teased with information rather than being given actual pieces of a puzzle. But overall, I think this was a masterfully written work of science fiction, and for me, it was a 9 out of 10. If anyone has read any of the sequels, let me know your spoiler-free thoughts in the comments. I think the first book does come to a breaking point, but it does feel like book 1 in a series. However, some of the reviews for the sequels make me wonder whether some of the mysteries are best left unsolved, so let me know what you think. For our second classic sci-fi book, we have Kesrith by C.J. Cherryh. Kesrith is the story of 2 mighty species fighting for a galaxy, a story of diplomacy and warfare, of conspiracy and betrayal, and of 3 flesh-and-blood people who found themselves thrown together in a life-and-death alliance. Kesrith is the first book in the Faded Sun trilogy, and was my patron pick of the month for April. I hadn't actually heard of this series before, but I was keen to try out this author because I'd heard good things about Foreigner, Cytine, and Down Below Station. Right at the start of the book, we get a weapons training scene, and it feels a little more like fantasy than sci-fi to me, but that's alright because I can enjoy a good training scene. I mean, the Rocky movies are basically 40% training montages, and I still watch all of them. But the book ends up being not all that much action-focused, because while there is a feeling of impending war, the story is much more about cultural differences than it is actual battle. Cherryh also takes time to build the world and create a rather inhospitable planet. I enjoyed her descriptions and found the prose relatively pleasant to read. The trouble for me was that she didn't fill this setting that she painted with a storyline that I was as engaged in, or with characters that I was as invested in. I would find myself going through page after page and struggling to really remember what was happening, and I would go back just to see if I had missed anything important, and I would pick up little extra details that I had missed, but nothing that made me excited and that made me want to really continue the story. Having finished the book, I can clearly picture the world, as well as the companion animals, the Dusai, which I quite enjoyed, but I'm struggling to recall any major plot points that would make me excited to continue the trilogy. It reminded me of other sci-fantasy of that era, but without some of the same depth and intrigue. The modern printings of this trilogy include all 3 books in an omnibus edition, so perhaps the 3 books work better altogether rather than 3 separate books, but for me, it just didn't really work stylistically, and I'm not currently motivated to finish the trilogy. I gave this one a 5 out of 10, but if you like a sci-fantasy that is focused a little bit more on culture and character, then perhaps you might connect with it more than I did. And just before we get to our next book, if you love sci-fi, feel free to hang out with us on Discord and Patreon. Check out the links in the description to see the perks of becoming one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs like Nima and a New Eden. And for our third classic sci-fi book, we have Startide Rising by David Brin. The Terran exploration vessel Streaker has crashed in the uncharted water world of Kesrith. Her human and dolphin crew battle armed rebellion and a hostile planet to safeguard a secret, the fate of the first race who seeded wisdom throughout the stars. This is book 2 of the Uplift saga, but it can be read as a standalone, and Startide Rising is my kind of sci-fi. It's a grand space opera with some hard science and big ideas. And the biggest idea of all is the concept of uplifting. In this universe, no species can reach sentience without being uplifted, which begs the question, who uplifted humans? It's a wonderful idea to think about. Where does consciousness come from? And also, what are the rights and responsibilities when uplifting another species? I also had to laugh thinking of Peter Watts reading this book, because after reading his theories on consciousness in Blindside, it makes me think that Startide Rising just about might have given him a heart attack. So how does it execute on this idea? Well, first, there's a lot of characters and a lot of POVs, and at times there's so much going on, it feels like there's not much going on, because we're getting so many little bite-sized pieces from so many different places. I tend to like anthropomorphized characters, but I'll be honest, I had a little bit of trouble differentiating between some of the human and dolphin characters. A number of times I had to flip back a few pages in order to remember who exactly was a human or a dolphin. Brin uses some techniques to differentiate the uplifted dolphins, such as they have certain speech mannerisms and they talk a lot in poems. This is something that some readers might enjoy, but it wasn't something that I was particularly drawn to, and Brin uses the poems quite a lot in the novel. So while there are some differences, and it makes sense that dolphins would be influenced by the humans, I was hoping that there would be more differences between the humans and the dolphins in terms of their personalities. My main issue with the book was that while I liked the world building and the ideas, I was never hooked by the plot. I kept thinking, what's our objective? What are the obstacles? And without that momentum, the story just felt very flat to me. It didn't feel like we were really building to something that was particularly exciting. I felt similarly when reading Revelation Space by Alistair Reynolds, but the last 150 pages of that book made it all worthwhile. Whereas the ending of Startide Rising was fine, but it just felt like a little bit more of the same kind of thing. I will say that I read most of this book on a plane, and I'm not sure if I was a bit tired or jet-lagged because I was just struggling to find the gold in a book that, on paper, should suit me perfectly. I gave this one a 6 out of 10, but I might have to reread this one in the future, not on a plane, because even though I didn't get as much out of it as I had hoped, I do think it has some more layers to uncover. And for our fourth and final classic sci-fi book, we have Solaris by Stanislaw Lem. When Chris Kelvin arrives at the planet Solaris to study the ocean that covers its surface, he finds himself and the crew examining the planet are plagued with repressed and newly real memories. Could it be the ocean creating these memories? And for what reason? Right away, Lem creates a fantastic sense of atmosphere as Kelvin approaches the planet of Solaris, and his arrival is not quite what he expected. It's a little creepy and mysterious and surreal. I can see why 2 film adaptations have been made because the visual descriptions are evocative, the tone is unsettling, and I could vividly picture everything that was happening in the book. As a fan of Philip K. Dick, I liked the process of Kelvin trying to figure out what exactly was real and who he could trust and whether he could even trust himself. Some of the history of Solaris is provided in a way that's a little info dumpy as Kelvin finds books and recordings around the station, It reminded me a little bit of a video game where you find recordings and listen to them or read things in order to find various clues about your environment. But I didn't mind this format because I found the science and the concepts that we learned through these info dumps to be very interesting without them slowing down the story too much. Lem is brilliant at combining these ethereal ideas with hard science. He just rides that line between science and philosophy like a perfectly balanced tightrope walker. I love that you could read this and think it's a book about the people. Or you could read it and think, it's a book about the ocean. It questions what humans understand, as well as the nature of understanding itself. The push and pull between conquering the external without fully understanding the internal, I think makes this one of the great works of science fiction. For me, this book was a 9.5 out of 10. I don't think it has any major flaws. I think the first half absolutely nails the atmosphere and the philosophy. I think the second half nails the philosophy, and the atmosphere was still really good, but it perhaps could have just introduced one or two new elements to elevate it to that next level, but overall, this is one of my all-time favorite sci-fi books. So there you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, subscribe. It's free, and you can find more sci-fi content over here.